1948. The Second World War had just ended. Governments were determined that the past should not be repeated. Avoiding war meant also avoiding the economic mistakes of the 20s and 30s. In erecting trade barriers, people thought they were protecting their economies, but as trade dried up, the result was economic ruin. So in 1948, the whole political and economic system needed to be overhauled. Stability, a sense of global community, they were the key. International organizations were created to restore economic cooperation and peace. Only 23 countries signed GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, but it turned out to be a major contributor to world economic security. 50 years later, the World Trade Organization has 132 members. It has taken over the duties of the old GATT, but it's also handling new areas of trade. International banking, telecommunications, high technology inventions.
The GATT brought order into the world jungle of trade. Because when you have the law of the jungle, the bigger animal eats the smaller animal. And it wasn't very much different in terms of world trade. Big countries, when there were no rules among countries, mutually agreed among all of them, could very easily exert more pressure than they could do in a multilateral system where every country has the means to have itself be heard.
The rules defined what governments could do and what they could not do with their trade policies. For example, countries could not discriminate between their trading partners. GATT also became a forum for countries to settle disputes and to negotiate lower trade barriers. 8 rounds of increasingly complex trade negotiations took place under GATT. All this meant a better climate for investment and job creation. In its 47 years, GATT saw trade barriers fall and an unprecedented growth in world trade. GATT's membership grew eventually from the original 23 to 128. Most were developing countries and were given special treatment to help them adjust to the rules. In the 1970s, a first major attempt to revise GATT rules was only partly successful. Relatively few countries signed all the new agreements of the Tokyo Round. Meanwhile, the global economy was going through a rough period because of sharp rises in oil prices and financial troubles. Protectionism threatened to return to world trade. Then in 1986, in Punta del Este, Uruguay, ministers from all around the world gathered to launch an event that was to transform world trade, the 8th round of GATT negotiations, the Uruguay Round. The negotiations lasted 7.5 years, and at the end, 125 countries participated. The Uruguay Round became the largest and most complex negotiation in history. It covered some of the most sensitive subjects of the time, so the stakes were high.
There is a sense at the same time of crisis, but also a very responsible answer to this situation and a collective wish to see the multilateral system control the situation.
During that time, the world went through even more political and economic changes. The walls were coming down in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet bloc. These economies were turning to market forces and international trade. More and more developing countries also realized that they could gain substantially by opening up their markets and participating more fully in world trade. Finally, when ministers gathered in Marrakesh in April 1994, they had before them an agreement that represents the most far-reaching reform of the trading system since GATT's birth. The Uruguay Round agreement is complex, but it can be summed up in two important achievements. The first is the creation of a new organization with full legal status, the World Trade Organization.
I believe it is indispensable from both an economic and a political perspective that the World Trade Organization should have the role that is foreseen for it in the concluded Uruguay round negotiations. Without that, the world into which we would be rapidly moving would be a divided world of conflicting blocs and countries with spheres of influence seeking the type of advantage over each other that has in the past led to wars and conflict.
The second achievement is that the World Trade Organization's agreements form a single package with unprecedented broad coverage. The first major reform of trade in agricultural products. The gradual elimination of long-standing restrictions in textiles and clothing. A further substantial reduction of tariff levels. The first international trade rules for services and intellectual property.
I conveyed your
And
message.
a more effective means of settling disputes.
The WTO agreements were agreed by consensus, which means that everybody concurred in them, which means that over 100 countries that participated in the Uruguay round agreed without any reservation to this whole enormous package.
There is flexibility. For example, developing countries are given more time to adjust, but in the end, no one opts out.
Countries do not lose their sovereignty by joining the World Trade Organization. Basically, the World Trade Organization represents a contract between countries. Now, let's think of an individual. I sign contracts. They definitely constrain my behavior. They limit what I'm going to be able to do. But I do this because I believe that there are offsetting benefits.